At the beginning, it doesn't feel like freedom at all. It feels like something has been ripped out of you. The silence is loud, almost suffocating. You reach for your phone without thinking, not because there's a message there, but because your body has been trained to expect one. And when there isn't, there's a kind of emptiness that settles in your chest. That emptiness can be mistaken for loss, for loneliness, even for love. But it's important to understand what's really happening in that moment. You're not just missing a person. You're withdrawing from a pattern, from a cycle that kept you emotionally activated, sometimes anxious, sometimes hopeful, sometimes deeply hurt, and then suddenly relieved. That unpredictability creates a kind of attachment that runs deeper than logic. So when the contact stops, your system doesn't immediately interpret it as peace. It interprets it as danger, as absence, as something being wrong. And that's why the silence feels so heavy at first. But if you stay with it, if you resist the urge to break it just to soothe the discomfort, something begins to shift. Slowly, almost quietly, your nervous system starts to settle. The constant anticipation, the waiting, the decoding of messages, the emotional ups and downs, they begin to fade. Not all at once, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways. You might find that one morning you wake up and they're not the first thought on your mind. Or you go through a whole afternoon without checking your phone. And when you notice that, it surprises you. Because for so long, your inner world revolved around their presence or their absence. And here's the deeper truth. What you called connection was often tension. What you called love was often uncertainty. Your body was living in a state of alertness, trying to maintain closeness while protecting itself from pain. That's exhausting. And when the silence continues, that exhaustion finally has space to release. This is where the shock begins, not in the loss of them, but in the return of yourself. You begin to hear your own thoughts again, without interference. Your decisions become clearer, not filtered through, how will they react, or what will this mean for us? You start to feel your emotions more cleanly, without them being entangled in someone else's behavior. There is a kind of stillness that emerges, and at first it feels unfamiliar. But unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. It means you're stepping out of survival mode. And as that stillness deepens, you may begin to notice something else. A sense of relief. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like your body is no longer bracing for impact. Like you can finally exhale without waiting for the next disruption. That's the freedom you didn't expect. Not the kind that comes with celebration, but the kind that comes with quiet. The kind that allows you to reconnect with parts of yourself that were pushed aside, your needs, your boundaries, your sense of worth that isn't dependent on someone else's attention. So yes, the silence is uncomfortable at first. It challenges everything you've been conditioned to believe about connection and closeness. But if you allow it, if you stay present with it instead of escaping it, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes space. And in that space, you don't just lose them. You finally begin to find yourself again. Sometimes, the silence you fear the most is the very thing that sets you free. And as that silence continues to create space inside you, something else begins to emerge. Something even more surprising, and at times, more confronting. You start to notice yourself again. Not the version of you that was constantly adjusting, accommodating, or second-guessing, but the one that existed before all of that began. At first, it can feel disorienting. You may catch yourself wondering, why did I tolerate that? Or, how did I become someone who accepted so little? And it's important here not to turn that into self-judgment. Because what you're seeing now isn't weakness, it's awareness. It's the natural result of stepping out of a dynamic that required you to abandon parts of yourself in order to maintain connection. You see, when you're entangled in that kind of relationship, the loss of self doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, almost invisibly. You start by compromising a little. Your time, your preferences, your boundaries, just to keep the peace. Just to feel close again. And over time, those small compromises accumulate. You begin to filter your words more carefully. You silence certain needs. You question your own perceptions. Not because you're incapable, but because you've adapted. Adaptation is a powerful human trait. It helps us survive. But sometimes what helps us survive in one environment slowly disconnects us from who we truly are. So when the contact ends and the emotional noise quiets down, you're left face to face with that realization. You've been living in a way that required you to shrink. And that realization can be shocking. Not because you didn't know something was off, but because you can now see it clearly, without distortion. You recognize the ways you overextended yourself, the times you ignored your intuition, the moments you chose connection over authenticity. And again, this isn't a place for blame. It's a place for understanding, because there was a reason you held on. There was a need being met, even if it came at a cost. Maybe it was the need to feel chosen, to feel valued, to feel that you mattered. These are deeply human needs. And when they're inconsistently met, they can become even more compelling. But here's where the shift begins. As you reconnect with yourself, you also begin to reclaim your inner authority. You start asking different questions, not, how do I get them back? But why did I abandon myself? And in that question, there is power, because it redirects your focus from the other person to your own inner world. You might rediscover things you once loved but set aside. You might notice how your body feels more at ease when you're not walking on emotional eggshells. You may even begin to trust your own thoughts again, instead of constantly seeking external validation. And that's not a small thing. To trust yourself again after you've been conditioned to doubt your own reality, that's profound. That's the beginning of healing, not just from the relationship, but from the patterns that kept you in it. What's truly surprising is that this rediscovery doesn't feel like becoming someone new. It feels like returning to someone familiar, someone you recognize even if it's been a while. There's a quiet sense of alignment that starts to take hold. You're no longer splitting yourself in two, one part trying to stay connected, the other trying to protect you. You become whole again, and from that place of wholeness, your perspective changes. You no longer see the relationship through the lens of what it could have been. You see it for what it required you to give up. And once you see that clearly, it becomes much harder to convince yourself that losing it was a loss at all. In fact, what you begin to understand is this. You didn't just lose them, you found the parts of yourself you were never meant to give away. And once you truly see that, you realize you were never too much. You were just too far from yourself. And as you continue returning to yourself, gaining clarity and a deeper sense of wholeness, there's another realization that can feel both surprising and unsettling. It has to do with them, with what's happening on the other side of that silence. Because part of you may still wonder, are they thinking about me? Do they miss me? Do they feel the absence the same way I once did? These are natural questions. They come from the part of you that once sought connection, that tried to make sense of the inconsistency, that hoped, perhaps, that underneath it all there was something real and mutual. But when you begin to look more closely, when you step out of the emotional fog, you start to see something different. What you begin to understand is that for someone who operates from that narcissistic pattern, the experience of loss is not the same. It's not rooted in the depth of connection, but in the disruption of control. And that distinction matters more than we often realize, because what kept the dynamic alive wasn't just your presence, it was your responsiveness. Your willingness to engage, to explain, to forgive, to come back, to stay open even when you were hurt. That responsiveness created a kind of emotional leverage. It allowed them to maintain influence over how you felt, how you saw yourself, even how you behaved. So when both of you stop contacting each other, something shifts, not just for you, but for them as well. The access they once had is gone. The ability to reach into your emotional world and elicit a reaction, it's no longer available. And that can feel unfamiliar, even destabilizing from their perspective. But it's important to be clear here. What they feel in that moment is not necessarily the kind of longing you once experienced. It's not the quiet ache of missing someone deeply, or the reflection that leads to genuine accountability. More often, it's a discomfort tied to the loss of influence, the absence of validation, the interruption of a pattern that once served them. And that's where the confusion can arise. Because if they do return, if they break the silence, it can look like care. It can sound like regret. But unless there has been a deeper shift, a real willingness to take responsibility and engage with honesty, what's often being restored is not the relationship, but the dynamic. This is why your clarity matters so much. Because without it, it's easy to interpret their behavior through your own emotional lens. You might assume that if they reach out, it must mean they've changed, that they've realized your value, that they finally understand what they lost. But understanding their pattern allows you to pause, to observe, to respond from awareness rather than hope. And in that awareness, you begin to reclaim something essential, your power to choose. Not from a place of resistance or anger, but from a place of grounded truth. You no longer need to decode their silence or chase their attention. You no longer need to prove your worth through your availability. You begin to see that your value was never dependent on their recognition. It was only obscured by the dynamic you were in. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to release the illusion that you were responsible for how they showed up. That if you had just said the right thing, done more, been more patient, more understanding, it would have turned out differently. That belief can keep you stuck for a long time. But the truth is you were responding from a place of care, and they were operating from a different place entirely. Not better or worse, just different. And once you accept that, without trying to change it, something inside you softens. You stop trying to make sense of what was never aligned with your way of relating, and that's when the real shift happens. You no longer look at their silence and wonder what it means about you. You understand what it reflects about them. And in that understanding, there is a kind of freedom that doesn't depend on their actions at all. So even if they never reach out, or even if they do, you're no longer waiting. Because you've come to see that what they lost was control, but what you regained was yourself. And that is not something you ever need to give away again. And as this understanding settles in, this clarity about what was really happening and what it meant, you begin to notice another shift, one that is quieter but deeply transformative. It's not something dramatic on the outside. It's something internal, subtle, but powerful. Your emotional dependence starts to loosen its grip. Now that doesn't happen overnight. In the beginning, the pull is still there. You still feel the urge to check your phone, to revisit old messages, to wonder what they're doing, who they're with, whether they've moved on. These thoughts don't disappear just because you've decided to step away. They're part of the conditioning, the emotional imprint that was formed over time. And again, it's important not to judge that. Because what you experienced wasn't just attachment. It was a kind of emotional conditioning shaped by inconsistency. Moments of closeness followed by distance, warmth followed by withdrawal. That pattern creates a powerful loop in the brain. It keeps you seeking, hoping, waiting. So when the contact stops, your system doesn't immediately relax. It searches. It craves resolution. It wants the familiar, even if the familiar was painful. But here's where something begins to change. As the days pass, and you don't act on every impulse, you create a new experience for yourself. You feel the urge, but you don't follow it. You notice the thought, but you don't engage with it in the same way. And in doing so, you begin to interrupt the pattern. At first, that can feel uncomfortable, even unsettling, because you're no longer feeding the cycle that once gave you a sense of connection, however unstable it was. But slowly, your system begins to learn something new, that you can feel the discomfort without needing to escape it. And that realization is incredibly important, because emotional dependence thrives on the belief that you cannot tolerate the absence of the other person, that without them, something essential is missing. But each time you sit with the silence, each time you allow the feeling to rise and pass without reacting, you prove to yourself that you are more capable than you thought. You begin to build a different kind of relationship, not with them, but with yourself. One based on presence rather than reaction, on awareness rather than urgency. You may start to notice that the intensity of the urges begins to fade. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once consumed your thoughts now visits only occasionally. And when it doesn't carry the same weight. It's just a thought, just a feeling, not a command you have to obey. And in that space, something else becomes possible. You begin to choose differently. You choose not to reach out, not because you're forcing yourself to stay away, but because you genuinely don't feel the same need. You choose to invest your energy elsewhere, into your work, your relationships, your own well-being. You start to experience moments of contentment that have nothing to do with them. And that's the real shift. Because emotional dependence is not just about missing someone, it's about losing your center in their presence or absence. And as that dependence begins to dissolve, you return to that center. You become less reactive, less driven by external validation, more grounded in your own experience. You're no longer waiting to feel okay based on whether they reach out or not. You feel okay because you've learned how to be with yourself. And that doesn't mean you've stopped caring. It means your care is no longer tied to your need. It's no longer something that overrides your boundaries or pulls you back into a dynamic that diminishes you. There's a quiet strength that emerges here. Not loud, not forceful, but steady. A kind of inner stability that doesn't need constant reassurance. And perhaps the most surprising part is this. The thing you once feared losing your connection to no longer defines you. You're not empty without them. You're not incomplete without their attention. You're not waiting anymore. Because the moment you stop needing them to regulate how you feel is the moment you truly begin to be free. And that freedom begins the day you realize you can miss them and still choose yourself. And as you continue to sit in that growing sense of emotional independence, something even more grounding begins to take shape. It's not just that you feel stronger or more in control. It's that you begin to see more clearly. A kind of clarity emerges that simply wasn't available to you before, no matter how hard you tried to think your way through it. Because when you're inside a dynamic like that, your perception is constantly being influenced. You're not just responding to what's happening. You're responding to confusion, to mixed signals, to moments of affection that interrupt the pain just enough to keep you invested. Your mind tries to make sense of it, to organize it into something logical, something that can be solved or improved. But clarity doesn't come from overthinking a distorted situation. It comes from stepping outside of it. And that's exactly what this silence gives you. Without the ongoing interaction, without the emotional highs and lows, your nervous system settles even further. And from that place of calm, your mind begins to reorganize what you experienced. Not through the lens of hope or fear, but through the lens of truth. You begin to remember things you once minimized. Moments that didn't sit right, but you brushed aside. Words that confused you, but you gave the benefit of the doubt. Patterns that repeated, but you kept trying to fix. And now, without the pressure to maintain the connection, you can finally ask yourself an honest question. What was actually happening here? That question can be uncomfortable, because the answers may challenge the story you held on to, the one that said, it's complicated, or they're just going through something, or if I try a little harder, it will change. But discomfort in this case is not something to avoid. It's a signal that you're getting closer to the truth. And the truth has a very different quality than confusion. It's not chaotic. It's not emotionally charged in the same way. It's steady. It may hurt, but it doesn't pull you in different directions. It allows you to see the relationship as it was, not as you hoped it could become. You begin to recognize the imbalance, not just in what was said or done, but in what was consistently missing. The lack of accountability, the inconsistency in care, the way your needs were often secondary or even dismissed, and perhaps most importantly, the way you had to adapt yourself just to keep the connection going. That's not something you could fully see when you were still inside it. Because when you're emotionally invested, your focus is often on preserving the bond, not evaluating it. You're trying to make it work, not questioning whether it should. But now that pressure is gone, and in its place you gain perspective. You start to understand that what you experienced wasn't a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of a dynamic that couldn't meet you where you were. You see that your efforts, your patience, your willingness to stay, they were real, but they were being poured into something that couldn't hold them in a healthy way. And that realization, while painful, is also deeply empowering, because it shifts the narrative. You're no longer asking, why wasn't I enough? You're beginning to ask, why did I stay in something that asked me to feel that way? And in that question, there is growth. There is a return to your own discernment, your ability to recognize what aligns with you and what doesn't. Your capacity to choose relationships not based on intensity, but on consistency, respect, and mutual care. This is the kind of clarity that changes how you move forward, not just in this situation, but in all your relationships. You become less tolerant of confusion, less willing to override your own intuition. You begin to trust what you feel, not dismiss it. You listen more closely to your inner signals, because you've seen what happens when you don't. And slowly, your standards shift, not as a defense, but as a reflection of self-respect. So what once felt like a painful ending begins to reveal itself as a necessary awakening. Not because it was easy, but because it showed you something essential that you couldn't have seen any other way. And in that clarity, you don't just understand the past, you change your future. Because once you see the truth clearly, you can no longer unsee it. And once you stop confusing intensity with love, you stop settling for anything that asks you to lose yourself. And as all of these shifts begin to settle within you, the quieting of the noise, the return to yourself, the clarity about what was and what wasn't, there's one final turning point that often surprises people the most. It's the moment you realize you no longer need anything from them to move forward. For a long time, there may have been a part of you that held on, not necessarily to the relationship itself, but to the idea of closure, the hope that one day they would explain, that they would finally acknowledge what happened, that they would take responsibility in a way that made sense of the pain you experienced, that they would say the words that would allow you to let go peacefully. And that hope can be incredibly persistent, because it feels reasonable. It feels human to want understanding, to want resolution, to want your experience to be seen and validated by the person who was part of it. But what you begin to understand as you continue to grow in your awareness is that waiting for that kind of closure can quietly keep you tied to the very dynamic you've been stepping out of, because it places your healing in their hands. It says in a subtle way, I can move on once they give me what I need. And that keeps a part of you looking back, waiting, staying emotionally available to someone who may never meet you in that space. But something changes as you deepen into your own clarity. You begin to see that closure is not something that is given, it's something that is created, not through their explanation, but through your understanding. Not through their apology, but through your willingness to face the truth of what you experienced and what it cost you. And that's not always easy, because it means letting go of the fantasy that it could have ended differently. It means accepting that the answers you wanted may never come in the form you hoped for. It means grieving not just the person, but the possibility you held on to. But within that grief, there is also a quiet liberation, because when you stop waiting for them to complete the story, you begin to write your own ending. You start to recognize that your healing was never dependent on their awareness, that your ability to move forward doesn't require their permission, that the meaning you've been searching for can be found within your own reflection, your own growth, your own decision to no longer participate in what hurt you. And that realization shifts something profound inside you. You're no longer pulled by the need for answers. You're grounded in the understanding you've already gained. You don't need them to validate your experience, because you've taken the time to truly see it for yourself. You don't need them to apologize, because you've acknowledged the impact it had on you, and you've chosen to honor that by not returning to it. There is a kind of strength in that. A quiet, steady strength that doesn't seek recognition. It simply knows. And from that place, your sense of power changes. It's no longer about control or about proving anything. It's about alignment, about choosing what reflects your values, your needs, your truth, about walking forward without needing to look back for confirmation that you're allowed to do so. You may still have moments of reflection, even moments of sadness. That's part of being human. But those moments no longer define your direction. They pass through you without pulling you off course, because you've come to understand something essential. That closure was never something they could give you. It was something you were always capable of claiming. And when you truly claim it, not as a reaction, but as a conscious decision, you step into a different kind of freedom, one that isn't dependent on anyone else's actions, one that stays with you, regardless of whether they return or remain silent. You are no longer waiting for the ending to be handed to you. You've already stepped into it. And the most powerful realization of all is this: you didn't need their closure to heal. You only needed your own truth to set you free.